returned from the city about 3 o'clock on that May afternoon in 1914, pretty well disgusted with life. I'd been 3 months in the old country and was fed up with it. Richard Hannay, I kept telling myself, you've got into the wrong ditch, my friend, and you'd better climb out. It made me bite my lips to think of the plans I'd been building up those last years in Bulawayo. I'd got my pile, not one of the big ones, but good enough for me, and I'd figured out all kinds of ways of enjoying myself. My father had brought me out from Scotland at the age of 6, and I'd never been home since, so England was a sort of Arabian Nights to me, and I counted on stopping there for the rest of my days. But from the first I was disappointed with it. In about a week I was tired of seeing sights, and in less than a month I'd had enough of restaurants and theatres and race meetings. On my way home, I turned into my club. I had a long drink and read the evening papers. They were full of a row in the Near East, and there was an article about Keralides, the Greek premier. From all accounts, he seemed the one big man in the show, and he played a straight game too, which was more than could be said for most of them. I gathered that they hated him pretty blackly in Berlin and Vienna, but that we were going to stick by him. And one paper said that he was the only barrier between Europe and Armageddon. About 6 o'clock, I went home, dressed, and dined at the Café Royal, and turned into a musical. I did not stay long. The night was fine and clear as I walked back to the flat that I'd hired near Portland Place. My flat was on the first floor in a new block. There was a common staircase with a porter and a liftman at the entrance. I had a fellow to look after me who came in by the day. He arrived before 8 o'clock every morning and used to depart at 7, for I never dined at home. I was just fitting my key into the door when I noticed a man at my elbow. He was slim, with a short brown beard and small, gimlety blue eyes. I recognized him as the occupant of a flat on the top floor, with whom I had passed the time of day on the stairs. "Can I speak to you? May I come in for a minute?" He was steadying his voice with an effort. I got my door opened and motioned him in. "I'm very sorry," he said humbly. "It's a mighty liberty, but you look the kind of man who would understand. Say, will you do me a good turn?" "I'll listen to you," I said. "That's all I'll promise." There was a tray of drinks on the table beside him, from which he filled himself a stiff whiskey and soda. He drank it off in 3 gulps and cracked the glass as he set it down. "Pardon," he said, "I'm a bit rattled tonight. You see, I happen at this moment to be dead." A smile flickered over his drawn face. "I'm not mad, yet. Say, sir, I've been watching you, and I reckon you're a cool customer. I'm going to confide in you. I need help, and I want to know if I can count you in." I sat down in the armchair and lit my pipe. "Get on with your yarn," I said, "and I'll tell you." He is an American from Kentucky, and after college had started out to see the world. He wrote a bit and acted as war correspondent for a Chicago paper. Spent a year or 2 in southeastern Europe. I gathered that he was a fine linguist, and he got to know pretty well the society in those parts. I read him as a sharp, restless fellow who always wanted to get down to the roots of things. He got a little further down than he wanted. Away behind all the governments and the armies, he told me, there was a big subterranean movement going on, engineered by very dangerous people. He had come on it by accident. It fascinated him. He went further, and then he got caught. I gathered that most of the people in it were the sort of educated anarchists that make revolutions, but that beside them there were financiers who were playing for money. A clever man can make big profits on a falling market, and it suited the book of both classes to set Europe by the ears. The aim of the whole conspiracy was to get Russia and Germany at loggerheads. "I guess you know the name Konstantin Keralides," he said. I nodded. "He is the man who has wrecked all their games. He's the one big brain in the whole show, and he happens also to be an honest man. Therefore, he has been marked down these 12 months past. I found that out, not that it was difficult, for any fool could guess as much, but I found out the way that they were going to get him, and that knowledge was deadly. That's why I have had to decease. He had another drink. I mixed it for him myself. They can't get him in his own land, for he has a bodyguard of Epirots that would skin their grandmothers. But on the 15th day of June, he is coming to this city. The British Foreign Office has taken to having international tea parties, and the biggest of them is due on that date. Karolides is the principal guest, and if my friends have their way, he will never return to his country. You can warn him. Keep him at home, I said. And play their game? He asked sharply. If he does not come, they win, for he's the only man that can straighten out the tangle. And if his government are warned, he won't come, for he does not know how big the stakes will be on June the 15th. What about the British government, I said. Tip them the wink, and they'll take extra precautions. No good. They might stuff your city with plainclothes detectives and double the police, and Constantine would still be a doomed man. He'll be murdered by an Austrian, and there'll be plenty of evidence to show the connivance of the big folk in Vienna and Berlin. It will all be an infernal lie, of course, but the case will look black enough to the world. I'm not talking hot air, my friend. I want to know every detail of the hellish contrivance, and it's not going to come off if there's a certain man who knows the wheels of the business alive right here in London on the 15th day of June, and that man is your servant, Franklin B. Scudder. I was getting to like the little chap. His jaw had shut like a rat trap, and there was the fire of battle in his gimlety eyes. Where did you find out this story? I asked. I completed my evidence 10 days ago in Paris. I can't tell you the details now, but it's something of a history. When I was quite sure in my own mind, I judged it my business to disappear, and I reached this city by a mighty queer circuit. Till yesterday, I thought I had muddied my trail some, and I was feeling pretty happy. Then I saw a man standing in the street outside this block. I watched him for a bit from my window, and I thought I recognized him. He came in and spoke to the porter. The sheer naked scare on his face completed my conviction of his honesty. I asked him what he did next. I had to die. If my pursuers knew I was dead, they would go to sleep again. How did you manage it? I told the man that valets me that I was feeling pretty bad, and I got myself up to look like death. That wasn't difficult, for I'm no slouch at disguises. Then I got a corpse. You can always get a body in London if you know where to go for it. I fetched it back in a trunk on top of a four-wheeler, and I had to be assisted upstairs to my room. You see, I had to pile up some evidence for the inquest. I went to bed, and I got my man to mix me a sleeping draught, and then told him to clear out. When I was left alone, I started in to fake the corpse. He was my size, and I judged had perished from too much alcohol, so I put some spirits handy about the place. The jaw was the weak point in the likeness, so I blew it away with a revolver. I dare say there will be somebody tomorrow to swear having heard a shot, but there are no neighbors on my floor, and I guessed I could risk it. So I left the body in bed, dressed up in my pajamas, with a revolver lying on the bedclothes and a considerable mess around. I had had you in mind all day, and there seemed nothing to do but to make an appeal to you. I watched from my window till I saw you come in, and then slipped down the stair to meet you. "Hand me your key," I said, "and I'll take a look at the corpse. Excuse my caution, but I'm bound to verify a bit if I can." He shook his head mournfully. "I reckoned you'd ask for that, but I haven't got it." It's on my chain, on the dressing table. I had to leave it behind, for I couldn't leave any clues to breed suspicions. The gentry who are after me are pretty bright-eyed citizens. You'll have to take me on trust for the night, and tomorrow you'll get proof of the corpse business right enough. I thought for an instant or two. Right. I'll trust you for the night. I'll lock you into this room and keep the key. Just one word, Mr. Scudder. I believe you're straight. But if so be you are not, I should warn you that I'm a handy man with a gun. I woke next morning to hear my man Paddock making the deuce of a row at the smoking room door. "Stop that row, Paddock," I said. "There's a friend of mine dossing down in there. Get breakfast for 2, and then come back and speak to me." I told Paddock a fine story about how my friend was a great swell, with his nerves pretty bad from overwork, who wanted absolute rest and stillness. Nobody had to know he was here. "Right, sir," said Paddock, and I knew I could count on his loyalty. I left Scudder with a newspaper and a box of cigars, and went down to the city to luncheon. When I got back, the liftman had an important face. "Nasty business here this morning, sir. Gent in number 15 been and shot himself. They've just took him to the mortuary. Police are up there now." I ascended to number 15 and found a couple of bobbies and an inspector making an examination. I asked a few idiotic questions, and they soon kicked me out. Then I found the man that had valeted Scudder and pumped him, but I could see he suspected nothing. I attended the inquest next day. The jury found it a case of suicide while of unsound mind, and the few effects were handed over to the American consul to deal with. I gave Scudder a full account of the affair. The first 2 days he stayed with me in that back room, he was very peaceful. He read and smoked a bit, and made a heap of jottings in a notebook, and every night we had a game of chess, at which he beat me hollow. He fixed up a list of the days till June the 15th, and ticked each off with a red pencil, making remarks in shorthand against them. I would find him sunk in a brown study, with his sharp eyes abstracted, and after those spells of meditation he was apt to be very despondent. One night he was very solemn. "Say, Hannay," he said, "I judge I should have let you a bit deeper into this business. I should hate to go out without leaving somebody else to put up a fight." And he began to tell me in detail what I had only heard from him vaguely. I remember that he was very clear that the danger to Karolides would not begin till he had got to London, and would come from the very highest quarters, where there would be no thought of suspicion. He mentioned the name of a woman, Julia Cecchini, as having something to do with the danger. She would be the decoy, I gathered, to get Karolides out of the care of his guards. He talked, too, about a black stone and a man that lisped in his speech, and he described very particularly somebody that he never referred to without a shudder, an old man with a young voice who could hood his eyes like a hawk. Next day he was much more cheerful. I went out to dinner with a mining engineer I had got to see on business, and came back about 10:30 in time for our game of chess. I pushed open the smoking-room door. The lights were not lit. I snapped the switch, but there was nobody there. Then I saw something in the far corner which made me drop my cigar and fall into a cold sweat. My guest was lying sprawled on his back. There was a long knife through his heart, which skewered him to the floor. I sat down in an armchair and felt very sick. I had seen men die violently before. Indeed, I had killed a few myself in the Matabele War. But this cold-blooded indoor business was different. I went over the flat with a small tooth comb. There was nobody there, nor any trace of anybody. I shuttered and bolted all the windows and put the chain on the door. I was in the soup. That was pretty clear. Any shadow of a doubt I might have had about the truth of Scudder's tale was now gone. The men who knew that he knew what he knew had found him, and had taken the best way to make certain of his silence. Yes, but he had been in my rooms for 4 days, and his enemies must have reckoned that he had confided in me, so I would be the next to go. Then suddenly I thought of another probability. Supposing I called the police, what kind of a story was I to tell them about Scudder? I had lied to Paddock about him, and the whole thing looked desperately fishy. If I made a clean breast of it and told the police everything he had told me, they'd simply laugh at me. The odds were 1,000 to 1 that I would be charged with murder, and the circumstantial evidence was strong enough to hang me. Few people knew me in England, and I had no real pal who would come forward and swear to my character. Besides, if I told the whole story, and by any miracle was believed, I would be playing their game. Karolides would stay at home, which was what they wanted. Somehow or other, the sight of Scudder's dead face had made me a passionate believer in his scheme. He was gone, but he had taken me into his confidence, and I was pretty well bound to carry on his work. It took me an hour or two to think this out, and by that time I had come to a decision. I must vanish somehow, and keep vanished, till the end of the 2nd week in June. Then I must somehow find a way to get in touch with the government people and tell them what Scudder had told me. It was now the 24th day of May, and that meant 20 days of hiding before I could venture to approach the powers that be. I reckoned that 2 sets of people would be looking for me, Scudder's enemies to put me out of existence, and the police, who would want me for Scudder's murder. My next thought was whether Scudder had any papers about him, to give me a better clue to the business. I searched his pockets. There was no sign of the little black book in which I had seen him making notes. That had no doubt been taken by his murderer. But as I looked up from my task, I saw that some drawers had been pulled out in the writing table. Someone must have been searching for something, perhaps for the pocketbook, and they had probably found it. Then I got out an atlas and looked at a big map of the British Isles. My notion was to get off to some wild district where my Feldcraft would be of some use to me. I considered that Scotland would be the best, for my people were Scotch, and I could pass anywhere as an ordinary Scotsman. I fixed on Galloway as the best place to go to. It was the nearest wild part of Scotland, so far as I could figure it out, and from the look of the map was not over thick with population. A search in Bradshaw informed me that a train left St. Pancras at 7:10, which would land me at any Galloway station in the late afternoon. That was well enough, but a more important matter was how I was to make my way to St. Pancras, for I was pretty certain that Scudder's friends would be watching outside. This puzzled me for a bit. Then I had an inspiration, on which I went to bed. I got up at 4. I hunted out a well-used tweed suit, a pair of strong nailed boots, and a flannel shirt with a collar. Into my pockets I stuffed a spare shirt, a cloth cap, some handkerchiefs, and a toothbrush. I'd drawn a good sum in gold from the bank 2 days before, and I took £50 of it in sovereigns and a belt, which I had brought back from Rhodesia. Then I had a bath, cut my moustache, which was long and drooping, into a short, stubby fringe. Paddock used to arrive punctually at 7:30 and let himself in with a latchkey. But about 20 minutes to 7, as I knew from bitter experience, the milkman turned up with a great clatter of cans and deposited my share outside my door. I had seen that milkman sometimes when I had gone out for an early ride. He was a young man, about my own height, with an ill-nourished moustache, and he wore a white overall. On him I staked all my chances. I went into the darkened smoking room, where the rays of morning light were beginning to creep through the shutters. There I breakfasted off a whisky and soda and some biscuits from the cupboard. By this time it was getting on for 6 o'clock. I put a pipe in my pocket and filled my pouch from the tobacco jar on the table by the fireplace. As I poked into the tobacco, my fingers touched something hard, and I drew out Scudder's little black pocketbook. That seemed to me a good omen. And 1 minute after 7:15, I heard the rattle of the cans outside. I opened the front door, and there was my man. He jumped a bit at the sight of me. "Come in here a moment. I want a word with you." And I led him into the dining room. "I reckon you're a bit of a sportsman, and I want you to do me a service. Lend me your cap and overall for 10 minutes, and here's a sovereign for you." "What's the game?" "A bet," I said. "I haven't time to explain, but to win it I've got to be a milkman for the next 10 minutes. All you've got to do is to stay here till I come back." "Right-o," he said. "I ain't no man to spoil a bit of sport. Here's the rig, governor." I stuck on his flat blue hat and his white overall, picked up the cans, banged my door, and went downstairs. At first I thought there was nobody in the street. Then I caught sight of a loafer shuffling past on the other side. Some impulse made me raise my eyes to the house opposite, and there at the first-floor window was a face. I crossed the street, whistling gaily and imitating the jaunty swing of the milkman. Then I took the first side street and went up a left-hand turning which led past a bit of vacant ground. I dropped the milk cans inside the hoarding and sent the hat and overall after them. At the moment, the clock of the neighbouring church struck the hour of 7. As soon as I got to Euston Road, I took to my heels and ran. The clock at Euston Station showed 5 past the hour. At St Pancras, I'd no time to take a ticket. A porter told me the platform, and as I entered it, I saw the train already in motion. 2 station officials blocked the way, but I dodged them and clambered into the last carriage. 3 minutes later, as we were roaring through the northern tunnels, an irate guard interviewed me. He wrote out for me a ticket to Newton Stewart, a name which had suddenly come back into my memory, and he conducted me from the first-class compartment where I had ensconced myself to a third-class smoker. I got out Scudder's little black pocket-book and studied it. It was pretty well filled with jottings, chiefly figures, though now and then a name was printed in. For example, I found the words Hofgaard, Luneville, and avocado pretty often, and especially the word Pavia. I was pretty sure that there was a cipher in all this. That is a subject which has always interested me, and I did a bit of it myself once as an intelligence officer in Delagoa Bay during the Boer War. This one looked like the numerical kind, where sets of figures correspond to the letters of the alphabet. But any fairly shrewd man can find the clue to that sort of code after an hour or two's work, and I didn't think Scudder would have been content with anything so easy. So I fastened on the printed words, for you can make pretty good numerical cipher if you have a keyword which gives you the sequence of the letters. I tried for hours, but none of the words answered. Then I fell asleep and woke at Dumfries, just in time to bundle out and get into the slow Galloway train. There was a man on the platform whose looks I didn't like, but he never glanced at me, and when I caught sight of myself in the mirror of an automatic machine, I didn't wonder. With my brown face, my old tweeds, and my slouch cap, I was the very model of one of the hill farmers who was crowding into the third-class carriages. I travelled with 6 in an atmosphere of shag and clay pipes. They had come from the weekly market, and their mouths were full of prices. About 5 o'clock, the carriages had emptied, and I was left alone, as I'd hoped. I got out at the next station, a little place right in the heart of a bog. An old station master was digging potatoes in his garden, and a child of 10 received my ticket. I emerged on a white road that straggled over the brown moor. It was a gorgeous spring evening, with every hill showing as clear as a cut amethyst. I actually felt light-hearted. I might have been a boy out for a spring holiday tramp instead of a man of 37, very much wanted by the police. I presently struck off the highway up a bypath which followed the glen of a brawling stream. It was some hours since I'd tasted food, and I was getting very hungry when I came to a herd's cottage set in a nook. A brown-faced woman was standing by the door and greeted me. When I asked for a night's lodging, she said I was welcome to the bed in the loft, and very soon she set before me a hearty meal of ham and eggs, scones, and thick sweet milk. By 6 the next morning I had breakfasted and was striding southwards again. My notion was to return to the railway line a station or two further on than the place where I had alighted yesterday, and double back. I reckoned that that was the safest way, for the police would naturally assume that I was always making further from London in the direction of some western port. By and by, I came to a swell of moorland which dipped to the vale of a little river, and a mile away in the heather I saw the smoke of a train. I followed the line to the next station. When I reached it, I waited in the deep heather till I saw the smoke of an east-going train on the horizon. Then I approached the tiny booking office and took a ticket for Dumfries. The only occupants of the carriage were an old shepherd and his dog, a wall-eyed brute that I mistrusted. The man was asleep, and on the cushions beside him was that morning's Scotsman. There were 2 columns about the Portland Place murder, as it was called. My man Paddock had given the alarm, and had had the milkman arrested. Poor devil. In the latest news I found a further instalment of the story. The milkman had been released, I read, and the true criminal, about whose identity the police were reticent, was believed to have got away from London by one of the northern lines. There was a short note about me as the owner of the flat. I guessed the police had stuck that in as a clumsy contrivance to persuade me that I was unsuspected. We were approaching the station at which I had got out yesterday. The potato-digging station-master had been gingered up into some activity, for the west-going train was waiting to let us pass, and from it had descended 3 men who were asking him questions. I supposed that they were the local police, who had been stirred up by Scotland Yard and had traced me as far as this one-horse siding. Sitting well back in the shadow, I watched them carefully. One of them had a book and took down notes. The old potato digger seemed to have turned peevish, but the child who had collected my ticket was talking volubly. All the party looked out across the moor where the white road departed. As we moved away from that station, my companion woke up. He fixed me with a wandering glance, kicked his dog viciously, and sleep once more laid its heavy hand on him. My plan had been to get out at some station down the line, but the train suddenly gave me a better chance, for it came to a standstill at the end of a culvert which spanned a brawling porter-coloured river. So I opened the door and prepared to drop quickly into the tangle of hazels which edged the line. It would have been all right, but for that infernal dog. Under the impression that I was decamping with its master's belongings, it started to bark, and all but got me by the trousers. This woke up the herd, who stood bawling at the carriage door in the belief that I had committed suicide. I crawled through the thicket, reached the edge of the stream, and in cover of the bushes put 100 yards or so behind me. Then from my shelter I peered back, and saw the guard and several passengers gathered round the open carriage door and staring in my direction. I could not have made a more public departure if I had left with a bugler and a brass band. Presently they had forgotten me, and when after a quarter of a mile's crawl I ventured to look back, the train had started again and was vanishing into the cutting. I was in a wide semicircle of moorland, with the brown river as radius and the high hills forming the northern circumference. There was not a sign or sound of a human being, only the plashing water and the interminable crying of curlews. I started to run. I ran till I had reached the rim of the mountain and flung myself panting on a ridge high above the young waters of the brown river. From my vantage ground I could scan the whole moor, right away to the railway line and to the south of it, where green fields took the place of heather. There I saw that which set my pulses racing. Low down in the south, a monoplane was climbing into the heavens. I was as certain as if I had been told that that aeroplane was looking for me, and that it did not belong to the police. For an hour or two I watched it, from a pit of heather. It flew long along the hilltops, and then in narrow circles over the valley up which I had come. Then it seemed to change its mind, rose to a great height, and flew away back to the south. I began to think less well of the countryside I had chosen for a refuge. These heather hills were no sort of cover if my enemies were in the sky. I looked with more satisfaction to the green country beyond the ridge, for there I should find woods and stone houses. About 6 in the evening I came out of the moorland to a white ribbon of road which wound up a narrow vale of a lowland stream. Presently I had reached a kind of pass where a solitary house smoked in the twilight. The road swung over a bridge, and leaning on the parapet was a young man. The smell of peat smoke and of some savoury roast floated to me from the house. "Is that place an inn?" I asked. "At your service," he said politely. "I am the landlord, sir, and I hope you will stay the night. For to tell you the truth, I've had no company for a week." I pulled myself up on the parapet of the bridge and filled my pipe. I began to detect an ally. "You're young to be an innkeeper?" "My father died a year ago and left me the business. It's a slow job for a young man, and it wasn't my choice of profession." "Which was?" "I want to write books." "Here's a true tale for you then," I cried, "and a month from now you can make a novel out of it." Sitting on the bridge in the soft May gloaming, I pitched him a lovely yarn. It was true in essentials, too, though I altered the minor details. I made out that I was a mining magnate from Kimberley, who had had a lot of trouble with a gang. They had pursued me across the ocean and had killed my best friend, and were now on my tracks. "By God," he whispered, drawing his breath in sharply, "it is all pure Rider Haggard and Conan Doyle." "You believe me?" I said gratefully. "Of course I do." And he held out his hand. He was very young, but he was the man for my money. "I think they're off my track for the moment, but I must lie close for a couple of days. Can you take me in?" He caught my elbow in his eagerness and drew me towards the house. As I entered the inn porch, I heard from far off the beat of an engine. There, silhouetted against the dusky west, was my friend, the monoplane. He gave me a room at the back of the house, with a fine outlook over the plateau, and he made me free of his own study, which was stacked with cheap editions of his favourite authors. An old woman called Margit brought me my meals, and the innkeeper was around me at all hours. He had a motor bicycle, and I sent him off next morning for the daily paper, which usually arrived with a post in the late afternoon. I told him to keep his eyes skinned, and make note of any strange figures he saw, keeping a special sharp lookout for motors and aeroplanes. Then I sat down in real earnest to Scudder's notebook. He came back at midday with the Scotsman. There was nothing in it, except some further evidence of Paddock and the milkman, and a repetition of yesterday's statement that the murderer had gone north. But there was a long article reprinted from the Times about Karolides and the state of affairs in the Balkans, though there was no mention of any visit to England. I got rid of the innkeeper for the afternoon, for I was getting very warm in my search for the cipher. As I thought, it was a numerical cipher, and by an elaborate system of experiments, I had pretty well discovered what were the nulls and stops. The trouble was the keyword, and when I thought of the odd million words he might have used, I felt pretty hopeless. But about 3 o'clock, I had a sudden inspiration. The name Julia Chikenye flashed across my memory. Scudder had said it was the key to the Karolides business, and it occurred to me to try it on his cipher. It worked. The 5 letters of Julia gave me the position of the vowels. A was J, the 10th letter of the alphabet, and so represented by X in the cipher. E was U, equals XX1, and so on. Cecchini gave me the numerals for the principal consonants. I scribbled that scheme on a bit of paper and sat down to read Scudder's pages. In half an hour, I was reading with a whitish face and fingers that drummed on the table. Just then, I glanced out of the window and saw a big touring car coming up the glen towards the inn. It drew up at the door, and there was a sound of people lighting. 10 minutes later, the innkeeper slipped into the room, his eyes bright with excitement. "There's 2 chaps below looking for you," he whispered. "They described you jolly well, down to your boots and shirt. I told them you'd been here last night and had gone off on a motorcycle this morning, and one of the chaps swore like a navvy." I made him tell me what they looked like. One was a dark-eyed, thin fellow with bushy eyebrows. The other was plump, always smiling, and lisped in his talk. Neither was any kind of foreigner. On this my young friend was positive. I took a bit of paper and wrote these words in German, as if they were part of a letter. Black Stone. Scudder had got on to this, but he could not act for a fortnight. I doubt if I can do any good now, especially as Karolides is uncertain about his plans. But if Mr. T advises, I will do the best I... ... I manufactured it rather neatly, so that it looked like a loose page of a private letter. "Take this down and say it was found in my bedroom, and ask them to return it to me if they overtake me." 3 minutes later I heard the car begin to move, and peeping from behind the curtain caught sight of the 2 figures. One was slim, and the other was plump. The innkeeper appeared in great excitement. "Your paper woke them up," he said gleefully. "Now I'll tell you what I want you to do," I said. "Get on your bicycle and go off to Newton Stewart to the chief constable. Describe the 2 men and say you suspect them of having something to do with a London murder. You can invent reasons. The 2 will come back, never fear. Not tonight, for they'll follow me 40 miles along the road, but first thing tomorrow morning. Tell the police to be here, bright and early." When he came back, we dined together. When he went to bed, I sat up and finished Scudder's notebook. I smoked in a chair till daylight, for I could not sleep. About 8 next morning, I witnessed the arrival of 2 constables and a sergeant. They put their car in a coach-house under the innkeeper's instructions, and entered the house. 20 minutes later, I saw from my window a second car come across the plateau from the opposite direction. It stopped 200 yards off in the shelter of a patch of wood. I noticed that its occupants carefully reversed it before leaving it. A minute or 2 later, I heard their steps on the gravel outside the window. My plan had been to lie hid in my bedroom and see what happened. Now I had a better idea. I opened the window and dropped quietly into a gooseberry bush. Unobserved, I won the high ground on the far side of the patch of trees. There stood the car, very spick and span in the morning sunlight. You may picture me driving that 40-horsepower car for all she was worth over the crisp moor roads on that shining May morning, driving with a vague eye, just wide enough awake to keep on the highway, for I was thinking desperately of what I had found in Scudder's pocket-book. The little man had told me a pack of lies. All his yarns about the Balkans and the anarchists and the Foreign Office Conference were eyewash, and so was Karolides. And yet not quite, as you shall hear. He told me something which sounded big enough, but the real thing was so immortally big that he, the man who had found it out, wanted it all for himself. I didn't blame him. It was risks, after all, that he was chiefly greedy about. The bare bones of the tale were all that was in the book, these, and one queer phrase which occurred half a dozen times inside brackets. 39 steps was the phrase, and its last time of use it ran, 39 steps, I counted them, high tide, 10:17 p.m. I could make nothing of that. The first thing I learned was that it was not a question of preventing a war. That was coming as sure as Christmas. Had been arranged, said Scudder, ever since February 1912. Karolides was going to be the occasion. He was booked all right, and was to hand in his cheques on June 14th, 2 weeks and 4 days from that May morning. I gathered from Scudder's notes that nothing on earth could prevent that. His talk of epirote guards that would skin their own grandmothers was all billy-o. The second thing was that this war was going to come as a mighty surprise to Britain. Karolides' death would set the Balkans by the ears, and then Vienna would chip in with an ultimatum. Russia wouldn't like that, and there would be high words, but Berlin would play the peacemaker and pour oil on the waters till suddenly she would find a good cause for a quarrel, pick it up, and in 5 hours let fly at us. That was the idea, and a pretty good one, too. Honey and fair speeches, and then a stroke in the dark. While we were talking about the goodwill and the good intentions of Germany, our coast would be silently ringed with mines, and submarines would be waiting for every battleship. But all this depended upon the third thing, which was due to happen on June the 15th. I would never have grasped this if I hadn't once happened to meet a French staff officer coming back from West Africa who had told me a lot of things. One was, in Parliament, there was a real working alliance between France and Britain, and that the two general staffs met every now and then and made plans for joint action in case of war. Well, in June, a swell was coming over from Paris, and he was going to get nothing less than a statement of the disposition of the British Home Fleet on mobilization. But on the 15th day of June, there were to be others in London, others at whom I could only guess. Scudder was content to call them collectively the Black Stone. They represented our deadly foes, and the information destined for France was to be diverted to their pockets. And it was to be used a week or two later with great guns and swift torpedoes, suddenly in the darkness of a summer night. This was the story that hummed in my brain as I swung in the big touring car from glen to glen. My first impulse had been to write a letter to the Prime Minister, but a little reflection convinced me that that would be useless. Who would believe my tale? I must show a sign, some token in proof, and heaven knew what that could be. Above all, I must keep going myself, ready to act when things got riper, and that was going to be no light job with the police of the British Isles in full cry after me, and the watchers of the Black Stone running silently and swiftly on my trail. I headed east by the sun, slowly sticking to the byways and several times ending up in remote farmyards with no alternative but to retrace my path and try again. So I passed the day, and evening was drawing in when I found myself driving along a glen with steep hills all about me, and a corkscrew road which climbed over a pass. At the top I heard a noise in the sky, and lo and behold, There was that infernal aeroplane flying low about a dozen miles to the south and rapidly coming towards me. My only chance was to get to the leafy cover of the valley. Down the hill I went like blue lightning, and screwing my head round whenever I dared to watch that damned flying machine. Soon I was on a road between hedges and dipping to a deep-cut glen of a stream. Then came a bit of thick wood. Suddenly, on my left, I heard the hoot of another car and realized to my horror that I was almost upon a couple of gateposts, through which a private road emerged onto the highway, and there before me a car was sliding athwart my course. I did the only thing possible and ran slap into the hedge on the right, trusting to find something soft beyond. My car crashed through the hedge and then gave a sickening plunge forward. I saw what was coming, leapt on the seat and would have jumped out, but a branch of hawthorn got me in the chest, lifted me up and held me, while a ton or two of expensive metal dropped with an almighty smash 50 feet to the bed of the stream. Slowly that thorn let me go. I subsided first on the hedge, and then very gently on a bower of nettles. As I scrambled to my feet, a hand took me by the arm, and a sympathetic voice asked me if I were hurt. I found myself looking at a tall young man in goggles and a leather ulster. "My blame, sir," I said. "It's lucky that I did not add homicide to my follies. That's the end of my Scotch motor tour, but it might have been the end of my life." He plucked out a watch and studied it. "You're the right sort of fellow," he said. "I can spare a quarter of an hour, and my house is 2 minutes off. Let's go there and take stock. Where's your kit, by the way? Is it in the burn along with the car?" "It's in my pocket," I said, brandishing a toothbrush. "I'm a colonial and travel light." "Colonial? By gad, you're the very man I've been praying for. Are you by any blessed chance a free trader?" "I am," said I, without the foggiest notion of what he meant. 3 minutes later we drew up in his car before a comfortable-looking shooting box set among pine trees, and he ushered me indoors. He took me first to a bedroom, and flung half a dozen of his suits before me, for my own had been pretty well reduced to rags. I selected a loose blue serge, which differed most conspicuously from my former garments, and borrowed a linen collar. Then he hailed me to the dining-room, where the remnants of a meal stood on the table, and announced that I had just 5 minutes to feed. I had a cup of coffee and some cold ham, while he yarned away on the hearthrug. "You find me in a deuce of a mess, Mr. By the by, you haven't told me your name." "Twisden. Any relation to old Tommy Twisden of the 60th? No? Well, you see, I'm a Liberal candidate for this part of the world, and I had a meeting on tonight at Brattleburn. I'd got the colonial ex-premier fellow, Crumpleton, coming to speak for me. This afternoon I had a wire from the ruffian saying that he'd got influenza at Blackpool, and here I am, left to do the whole thing myself. I simply cannot last the course. Now, you've got to be a good chap and help me. You're a free trader, and can tell our people what a washout protectionism is in the colonies. All you fellows have the gift of the gab. I wish to heaven I had it." "All right, then. I'm not much good as a speaker, but I'll tell them a bit about Australia." He lent me a big driving coat, and as we slipped down the dusty roads, poured into my ears the simple facts of his history. He was an orphan, and his uncle had brought him up. I've forgotten the uncle's name. But he was in the cabinet, and you can read his speeches in the papers. He'd gone round the world after leaving Cambridge, and then, being short of a job, his uncle had advised politics. As we passed through a little town, 2 policemen signalled us to stop, and flashed their lanterns on us. "Beg pardon, Sir Harry," said one. "We've got instructions to look out for a car, and the description's not unlike yours." "Right-ho," said my host, while I thanked Providence for the devious ways I had been brought to safety. The next thing I knew, we had drawn up outside a door in a street, and were being welcomed by some noisy gentlemen with rosettes. The hall had about 500 in it. Women, mostly. A lot of bald heads and a dozen or two young men. The chairman, a weaselly minister with a reddish nose, lamented Crumpleton's absence, soliloquized on his influenza, and gave me a certificate as a trusted leader of Australian thought. There were 2 policemen at the door, and I hoped they took note of that testimonial. Then Sir Harry started. I never heard anything like it. He didn't begin to know how to talk. He had about a bushel of notes from which he read, and when he let go of them he fell into one prolonged stutter. Yet, in a queer way, I liked the speech. You could see the niceness of the chap shining out behind the muck with which he had been spoon-fed. I didn't get on so badly when it came to my turn. I simply told them all I could remember about Australia, praying there would be no Australian there, all about its Labour Party and emigration and universal service. I doubt if I remembered to mention free trade, but I said there were no Tories in Australia, only Labour and Liberals. That fetched a cheer, and I woke them up a bit when I started in to tell them the kind of glorious business I thought could be made out of the Empire if we really put our backs into it. When we were in the car again, my host was in wild spirits at having got his job over. "A ripping speech, Twisden," he said. "Now you're coming home with me, and I'm all alone, and if you'll stop a day or two, I'll show you some very decent fishing." We had a hot supper, and I wanted it pretty badly, and then drank grog in a big, cheery smoking room with a crackling wood fire. I thought the time had come for me to put my cards on the table. I saw by this man's eye that he was the kind that you can trust. "Listen, Sir Harry," I said, "I've something pretty important to say to you. You're a good fellow, and I'm going to be frank." It was the first time I'd ever told anyone the exact truth, as far as I understood it, and it did me no end of good, for it straightened out the thing in my own mind. I blinked no detail. He heard all about Scudder, and the milkman, and the notebook, and my doings in Galloway. "So you see," I concluded, "you have got here in your house the man that is wanted for the Portland Place murder. Your duty is to send your car for the police and give me up. If you do, I don't think I'll get very far. There'll be an accident, and I'll have a knife in my ribs an hour or so after arrest. Nevertheless, it's your duty, as a law-abiding citizen." He was looking at me with bright, steady eyes. "I may be an ass on the platform, but I can size up a man. You're no murderer, and you're no fool, and I believe you're speaking the truth. I'm going to back you up. Now, what can I do?" "What about a letter to your uncle? I've got to get in touch with the government people sometime before the 15th of June. "That won't help. This is Foreign Office business. My uncle would have nothing to do with it. No, I'll go one better. I'll write to the permanent secretary at the Foreign Office. He's my godfather, and one of the best going." He sat down at a table and wrote to my dictation. The gist of it was that if a man called Twisden, I thought I'd better stick to that name, turned up before June the 15th, he was to treat him kindly. He said Twisden would prove his bona fides by passing the word Black Stone and whistling Annie Laurie. "Good," said Sir Harry. "That's the proper style. By the way, you'll find my godfather, his name's Sir Walter Bullivant, down at his country cottage for Whitsuntide. It's close to Artinswell on the Kennet. Now, what's the next thing?" "Lend me the oldest tweed suit you've got. Then show me a map of the neighbourhood and explain to me the lie of the land. Lastly, if the police come seeking me, just show them the car in the glen. If the other lot turn up, tell them I caught the South Express after your meeting." I shaved off the remnants of my moustache and got inside an ancient suit of what I believe is called heather mixture. The map gave me some notion of my whereabouts, and told the 2 things I wanted to know. where the main railway to the south could be joined, and what were the wildest districts near at hand. At 2 o'clock he wakened me from my slumbers in the smoking-room armchair, and led me blinking into the dark, starry night. An old bicycle was found in a tool shed. "First, turn to the right, up, by the long firwood. By daybreak you'll be well into the hills." I was on the central boss of a huge upland country, and could see everything moving for miles. It was now about 7 o'clock in the morning, and as I waited, I heard once again that ominous beat in the air. Then I realized that my vantage ground might be in reality a trap, for there was no cover for a tom-tit in those bald green places. I sat quite still and hopeless while the beat grew louder. Then I saw an airplane coming up from the east. It was flying high, but as I looked it dropped several hundred feet and began to circle round the knot of hill in narrowing circles, just as a hawk wheels before it pounces. Now it was flying very low, and now the observer on board caught sight of me. I could see one of the two occupants examining me through glasses. Suddenly it began to rise in swift walls, and the next thing I knew it was speeding eastward again, until it became a speck in the blue morning. That made me do some savage thinking. My enemies had located me, and the next thing would be a cordon round me. The airplane had seen my bicycle, and would conclude that I was trying to escape by the road. In that case, there might be a chance on the moors to the right or left. I wheeled the machine 100 yards from the highway and plunged it into a moss hole where it sank among pondweed and water buttercups. Then I tossed a coin. Heads right, tails left. And it fell heads, so I turned to the north. In a little I came to the brow of a ridge. Looking back, I saw the high road for maybe 10 miles, and far down it something that was moving, and that I took to be a motor car. Beyond the ridge, I looked on rolling green moor, which fell away into wooded glens. Way down the slope, a couple of miles away, several men were advancing, like a row of beaters at a shoot. I dropped out of sight behind the skyline. That way was shut to me, and I must try the bigger hills to the south beyond the highway. The car, I had noticed, was getting nearer, but it was still a long way off, with some very steep gradients before it. I ran hard, crouching low except in the hollows. If you are hemmed in on all sides in a patch of land, there is only one chance of escape. You must stay in the patch and let your enemies search it and not find you. That was good sense, but how on earth was I to escape notice in that tablecloth of a place? Then, in a tiny bight of road, beside a heap of stones, I found the roadman. He'd just arrived, and was wearily flinging down his hammer. "Confound the day I ever left the herding," he said, as if to the world at large. "There was my ain master, and I'm a slave to the government, tethered to the roadside with a saireen in a back like a sickle." He took up the hammer, struck a stone, dropped the implement with an oath, and put both hands to his ears. "Mercy on me, my head's bursting." He was a wild figure, about my own size, but much bent, with a week's beard on his chin and a pair of big horn spectacles. "I canna day it. The surveyor maun just report me home for my bed." I asked him what was the trouble. "The trouble is that I'm no sober. Last nicht my daughter Merrin was wedded, and they danced till 4 in the byre. Me and some other cheers sat down to the drinking, and here I am." I agreed with him about bed. "It's easy speaking, but I got a postcard yesterday saying that the new road surveyor would be round today.
He'll come and he'll na find me, or else he'll find me fou, and either way I'm a done man.
Does the new surveyor know you?
Know him? He's just been a week at the job. He rins about in a wee motor car, and would spare the inside out of a whelk.
Where's your house? I asked, and was directed by a wavering finger to a cottage by a stream.
Well, back to your bed and sleep in peace. I'll take on your job for a bit and see the surveyor.
His face broke into a vacant, drunkard smile.
You're the Billy. It'll be easy enough managed. My name's Alexander Turnbull, and I've been 7 years at the trade, and 20 afore that, herding and letting water. My friends call me Ecky, and Wiles Specky, for I wear glasses. Just you speak the surveyor fair and call him sir.
I borrowed his spectacles and filthy old hat, stripped off coat, waistcoat and collar, and gave him them to carry home, borrowed too the foul stump of clay pipe as an extra prop. He indicated my simple tasks, and without more ado, set off and ambled bedwards. With a handful of dust, I made a watermark round my neck, the place where Mr. Turnbull's Sunday ablutions might be expected to stop. I rubbed a good deal of dirt also into the sunburn of my cheeks. My toilet complete, I took up the barrow and began my journey to and from the quarry, 100 yards off. Now and then a sheep wandered off the heather to stare at me. A heron flopped down to a pool in the stream and started to fish, taking no more notice of me than if I had been a milestone. On I went, trundling my loads of stone, with the heavy step of the professional. Suddenly, a crisp voice from the road, and looking up, I saw a little Ford two-seater and a round-faced young man in a bowler hat. "Are you Alexander Turnbull? I am the new county road surveyor. You live at Blackenfoot, and have charge of the section from Laidlaw Byres to the rigs. Good. Fair bit of road, Turnbull, not badly engineered. Little soft for a mile off, and the hedges want cleaning. See you look after that. Good morning. You'll know me the next time you see me." Towards noon, I was cheered by a little traffic. A baker's van breasted the hill, sold me a bag of ginger biscuits, which I stowed in my trouser pocket against emergencies. Then a herd passed with sheep. Just about midday, a big car stole down the hill, glided past, and drew up 100 yards beyond. Its 3 occupants descended and sauntered towards me. 2 of the men I had seen before from the window of the Galloway Inn. The third had the look of a countryman, a vet perhaps, or a small farmer. He was dressed in ill-cut knickerbockers, and the eye in his head was as bright and wary as a hen's. "Morning," said the last. "That's a fine, easy job of yours?" I slowly and painfully stretched my back after the manner of roadmen, spat vigorously after the manner of Low Scott, and regarded them steadily before replying. "There's war jobs and there's better," I said sententiously. "I would rather hear yours, sitting all day on your hinderlands on those cushions. It's you and your muckle course that wreck my roads, and if we had our rights, you should be made to mend what you break." One of the others had been looking at my boots, and a word in German called the first speaker's attention to them. "You've a fine taste in boots," he said. "These were never made up by a country shoemaker." "They were not. They were made in London. I got them fra the gentleman that was here last year for the shooting." Again the sleek one spoke in German. "Let's get on," he said. "This fellow is all right." They asked one last question. "Did you see anyone pass early this morning? He might be on a bicycle, or he might be on foot." "Since I came up here, there has just been one baker in the Rothschild herd besides you, gentlemen." One of them gave me a cigar, which I smelt gingerly, and stuck in Turnbull's bundle. They got into their car,
and were out of sight in 3 minutes. My next step puzzled me. I had a notion that the cordon was still tight round the glen, and that if I walked in any direction I should meet the questioners. But get out I must. I stayed at my post till about 5 o'clock. By that time I had resolved to go down to Turnbull's cottage at nightfall, and take my chance of getting over the hills in the darkness. But suddenly a new car came up the road, and slowed down a yard or two from me. A fresh wind had risen, and the occupant wanted to light a cigarette. It was a touring car, with the tonneau full of an assortment of baggage. One man sat in it, and by an amazing chance I knew him. His name was Marmaduke Jopley, and he was an offence to creation. He was a sort of blood stockbroker who did his business by toadying eldest sons and rich young peers and foolish old ladies. I had a business introduction to his firm when I came to London, and he asked me to dinner at his club. There he showed off at a great rate, and pattered about his duchesses till the snobbery of the creature turned me sick. There he was, nattily dressed in a fine new car, obviously on his way to visit some of his smart friends. In a second I had jumped into the tonneau and had him by the shoulder. "Hallo, Jopley! Well met, my lad." "Who the devil are you?" he gasped. "My name's Hannay, from Rhodesia, you remember?" "Good God! The murderer!" "Just so. And there'll be a second murder if you don't do as I tell you. Give me that coat of yours, that cap, too." He did as bid, for he was blind with terror. Over my dirty trousers and shirt, I put on his smart driving coat, which buttoned high at the top and thereby hid the deficiencies of my collar. I stuck the cap on my head and added his gloves to my get-up. The dusty roadman in a minute was transformed into one of the neatest motorists in Scotland. On Mr. Jopley's head I clapped Turnbull's unspeakable hat, and told him to keep it there. Then with some difficulty I turned the car. My plan was to go back the road he had come, for the watchers, having seen it before, would probably let it pass unremarked, and Marmy's figure was in no way like mine. "Now, my child," I said, "sit quite still and be a good boy. I mean you no harm. I'm only borrowing your car for an hour or two. But if you play me any tricks, and above all if you open your mouth, as sure as there's a God above, I'll wring your neck. Savez?"